Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Richard French. Election day, believe it or not, only 62 days away, and President Trump and Joe Biden made dueling appearances this afternoon. President Trump visiting North Carolina today to commemorate the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. The president, he met WW2 veterans and he spoke in front of a decommissioned warship that fought in the war, but he also, as he does, gets political, and he chose the event to go after Biden. A bit later in the program, we're going to show you why some veteran groups were not only against this visit, but they also say Trump has dishonored our military too many times and he's using vets as props, and you'd be surprised as to how much the current military, which way they're leaning come November. Joe Biden, he gave a speech of his own from Delaware today, pushing for the White House to come up with a plan to safely reopen schools. Right now, it is all patchwork with teachers, parents, administrators confused, concerned. That as they try to make plans for the fall. In district to district, there's different plans. Biden, he went right after the president.
Mr. President, where are you? Where are you? Why aren't you working on this? We need emergency support funding for our schools, and we need it now. Mr. President, that's your job. That's your job. That's what you should be focused on now, getting our kids back to school safely.
Biden, he also took questions, and in them he denounced the violence and President Trump's handling of it a day before the former VP is scheduled himself to visit Kenosha, Wisconsin.
To engage in violence, burning, looting, and the rest in the name of protesting is wrong, and the persons should be held accountable for their actions. And so what I'd be doing is I'd be bringing people together in the White House right now. I'd be having that police commission set up. I'd have law enforcement at the table. I'd have the community at the table. I'd have people and saying, how do we get through this? What do we do to deal with this? Because I believe the vast majority of the community at writ large, as well as law enforcement, want to straighten things out, not inflame things. But this president keeps throwing gasoline in the fire.
And we will have full coverage of Biden's trip to Wisconsin on RFL tomorrow evening. In the meanwhile, on this program, we talk a lot about how, among others, but most notably, Fox News is out of the mainstream on a lot of things, and how the network is a constant cheerleader for the president and his worst instincts. It always seems like Fox followed Trump, not the other way around. But there's a new book by CNN's chief media correspondent, Brian Stelter, and it shows that it's actually the president often taking his cues from the network. We'll speak with Stelter in a few minutes, but I first wanted to spell out his premise first. The book, it is called Hoax: Donald Trump, Fox News, and the Dangerous Distortion of Truth. So we know, obviously, where this author stands. Now, Stelter said he spoke with dozens of both former and current people at the network, in fact, more than 100 of each, and they told him they've picked certain stories knowing the president was, in fact, an audience. It seems pretty clear that the president was watching Laura Ingraham in March when she started talking about hydroxychloroquine, a drug that few had previously ever heard of.
Our own John Roberts pressed Dr. Anthony Fauci about the drug we first introduced to the wider public on Monday.
There has been some promise with hydroxychloroquine.
Soon after, Dr. Fauci was asked about this mystery drug during a briefing, and he said he did not support using it. Not enough testing, he said, had been done. Then Ingram went on the air and said she respected Fauci, but she continued to talk up the drug despite warnings from the country's leading infectious disease expert. That same day, magically, the president tweeted about hydroxychloroquine for the first time, overlooking all of Fauci's concerns. By the way, the FDA wound up revoking the authorization to use the drug, warning of serious side effects, including heart problems, and also its lack of effectiveness. Some studies even showed that taking the drug could prove fatal. And even a more blatant example of Trump following Fox happened just a month later in April. Listen closely for the name of the group referenced in this Fox report.
In Minnesota, the demonstrators didn't even wait for their own planned protest. They referenced things like President Trump's statement that the cure cannot be worse than the disease. Liberate Minnesota calls Governor Tim Walz's stay-at-home order an overreaction.
That story aired at 10:19 Central Time, exactly 2 minutes later, President Trump, he tweeted, "Liberate Minnesota," the first mention from him of this so-called liberation movement against COVID restrictions. He also continued to beat that drum, trying to pressure Democratic governors to open up their states, even if the virus continued to spread. Those are scenes with the guys with the automatic weapons literally spitting in the face of cops, of course. Those are militia unmasked. Now, this clip, it shows how Trump and Fox, they act as an echo chamber for each other.
The violence is fueled by dangerous rhetoric from far-left politicians that demonize our nation and demonize our police.
When the rioters come for your town, and they're coming, will Biden and his team do enough to stop them?
These are thugs out there attacking law-abiding citizens.
Since these are people who are now crossing state lines, clearly, and this is being organized using the internet.
They will burn down your cities and tell you that you did it. And if you don't accept that judgment, maybe they'll send BLM to your house.
Literally, I could have hundreds of examples of the president following the lead when it comes to Fox News. The group Media Matters says Trump, he has live tweeted things he's seen on Fox nearly 300 times, and that was just from the first 6 months of this calendar year. Now, Stelter's book also describes the president's relationship with Fox hosts like Tucker Carlson, with those guys serving as de facto cabinet members, giving advice to the commander-in-chief. Sometimes he seeks out their advice over his own cabinet. Trump, he may love them, but apparently it is not always mutual. Stelter says Hannity thinks that Trump is, quote, bat bleep crazy, and again, those Hannity's reportedly own words. For more, let's bring now in Brian Stelter. I always thought that Trump would fire off a tweet in the dead of night or when he got up in the morning, and then Fox would scramble to try and find some supporting narrative to give it legitimacy. Did you think before you spoke to, what was it, 140 staffers currently at Fox and 180 former ones, that that was the case, or did you know going into the book that obviously sometimes it was the tail wagging the dog?
The coordination and the coziness definitely shocked me. In the words of one producer at Fox and Friends, people think that Trump tells us what to say. Heck no, it's the opposite. We tell him what to say. And that is oftentimes true. There are hundreds of times where the banners on Fox and Friends, the slogans and the talking points on Hannity's show become talking points for the president. But it does go both in all different ways, Richard. It goes in all different directions. Sometimes it is the president starting a narrative and then Fox picking up with it. And in many cases, the reason why this matters is because he's spreading mis and disinformation. And so is the network. I wouldn't have written this book if, Fox was providing the highest quality news to the president and helping him know what's going on in the world. And there wouldn't really be a story to tell. The real story here is about the misinformation that's being spread.
I think for a lot of us, especially if you were in the New York market, a lot of people didn't take the Trump campaign seriously in the beginning when he came down the escalator because they knew of the Trump shtick if you were in New York. But I'd always thought it was The Apprentice that made him such a darling, even in conservative media, that he was this success story, etc. But what I got from the book was it was actually a weekly segment right around when he was pushing the birtherism that Ailes gave him as a phoner into Fox and Friends. And for a lot of people, that was his first, if not introduction here, where people loved what they were getting in the morning on Fox, and that's what gave him so much popularity.
Yeah, I really believe The Apprentice gave Donald Trump his business identity around the world, but it was Fox and Friends that gave him his political identity. It was almost like going to school, because every week he's calling into Fox and Friends for 4 years. He's being asked questions about what Fox is covering. So by calling in, he's learning about Fox's priorities. He's learning about Roger Ailes and the Republican Party's priorities, and he's learning what really works on Fox. So you take that and you go to his rallies and his campaign events, and he sounds just like a Fox superstar. It's hard to know where Trump ends and Fox begins. And for the network, that's a good thing. It's profitable. It helps the network make a lot more money. But I argue in Hoax, this has been a bad thing for the president and for the country, because oftentimes the president gets fooled by Fox. He gets conspiracy theories from Fox. And then the entire country gets time wasted when we're all talking about ridiculous stories that all started on Fox and Friends. And look, that's really true with the pandemic. As you mentioned, hydroxychloroquine, these other narratives started on Fox and then jumped to the president.
And hardly limited to that. I mean, one of the, among the stories that legitimately scare me is that Ukraine came onto the national landscape, or at least on the president's radar, not on some briefing, he doesn't read his briefings, but because Hannity was pushing this as a theory. And as you do in the book, you can show how one step led to the other, to the eventual impeachment, because he heard the name Yovanovitch, and then so much of this spiraled. The idea that Sean Hannity is basically forming foreign policy for this country. You also write that Tucker Carlson talked the president out of potentially a military action against Iran. I can't believe I'm saying this. Thank you, Tucker, for that. But that these are the guys, not members of the cabinet, not members of national security, Fox hosts, they're shaping our foreign policy.
I think this is why it's essential to understand the Fox angle of the Trump years. That's why I'm glad you call it out. That's why I try to call it out on my CNN program. People need to know that because the president's a Fox News addict, he gets these ideas from Fox, he gets misinformed, and as a result, these stars have a lot of power. The problem is they don't use that power responsibly. For example, at Fox and Friends, the producers are told, why would you ever want to go to another show? You get to influence the president. Well, sure, they are influencing the president, but they're giving him bad information. They're obsessing over riots when those riots happened weeks or months ago. They talk about New York City like it's some hellhole when we all know that it's not. Of course, the city has its problems, but they talk about it as if it's some foreign country. It's really a shame the way that they create these us versus them narratives that the president then repeats.
And literally the makeup of the government has changed because of Fox. You write in your book that literally cabinet members will be shown the door if Fox talent decides to go after them. And conversely, I think I saw a number here, by the middle of this year, 20 people had gone from Fox to the White House, including a cabinet member and a deputy chief of staff. They literally are shaping who gets to get in his ear, not just what he watches on TV.
Yeah, the revolving door has been swinging for decades in Washington. You did have some folks go from places like Time Magazine to the Obama administration, but it happens much more intensely now in the Fox-Trump administration. President Trump really is the Fox News president, not literally running Fox, but he governs like he's the Fox News president. And that has left the rest of the country, without a functioning, effective chief executive. That's why I had to write this book, because there's so many examples that are so shocking, and because so many staffers at the network and in the White House are concerned about this. For example, you talk to Fox executives who say, I wish the president would watch less TV. Well, isn't that a little hypocritical coming from the network of choice?
Let's talk about Hannity, because what people forget is towards the end of the Obama years, he was struggling. And there was talk, as you write in your book, about maybe pairing him with another host here because he wasn't having certainly the influence he was. And then he was one of the first to really identify Trump and hitch his wagon to it. But Hannity, as you write, almost dreads the nightly phone calls with the president, who seems to want to almost produce his program and the following show, picking guests and everything, more than creating policy. So talk about the relationship with Hannity and the president. I want to remind people, Hannity literally emceed an event for the president. So the idea of objectivity here is beyond farcical proportions.
Well, Hannity has a great gig. He gets to stay in his mansion on Long Island, host his program. He was doing that well before the pandemic forced all of us into our home studios. Hannity is getting paid $35, $40, $45 million a year. He is, rich beyond belief by being this GOP promoter, this GOP cheerleader. But as you mentioned, in private, according to Hannity's friends and his colleagues, he is critical of Trump. He's on these long phone calls with Trump, and he says the president's like a run-on sentence. People talk about Hannity vaping. He says, if you heard what I've been hearing, you'd be vaping too. It's stressful. So there's that disconnect between what Hannity is saying on the air, where he's defending the president at all costs, versus what he's saying off the air, that I think is hypocritical. And look, if he wants to push back on that or deny that or say something, he's welcome to. All the reporting's in the book, and I offered to go on his show and have him come on my show, and he hasn't taken me up on the offer yet.
What would happen, Brian, if some of the Fox folks got together and said, listen, the mishandling of COVID is so bad, forget about the loss of life here, but to our economy and everything else, let's collectively start pushing the president through the idiot box here, talking through TV to say, you know, this is very real. If we don't take this seriously, if we don't do this, if they did that 4 or 5 months ago, do you believe the president would have followed their lead? Or do you think at the end of the day, Trump's going to do whatever he wants to do?
I think the history of the past 3.5 years has shown us that what Fox is saying in the morning and the evening does affect the president deeply. So in February, when the network was downplaying the pandemic and focusing on the politics of the crisis and not the medicine, not the health, it kind of lulled the president into a false sense of complacency. Look, there's a lot of blame to go around for what's going wrong. And I'm the first to say that, and I say that very early on in Hoax. Mayors and governors, there's a lot of blame to go around. But the president had the biggest megaphone of all. And he was downplaying this threat right up until mid-March, when he finally started taking it more seriously. At the same time, Fox started to take it more seriously. So in the timeline in Hoax, you can see how similar the responses between Trump and Fox were. And don't take it from me. Take it from the people all across America who've ridden into the FCC and said, Hannity, you know, my mom believes Hannity and it's putting her at risk. My dad believes Laura Ingraham and it's putting him at risk. That's really a sad state of affairs. But, you know, Tucker Carlson did try in early March. He drove to Mar-a-Lago. He tried to talk some sense into Trump. I'm not sure that worked right away, but it is worth noting, even some people at Fox were trying to sound the alarm.
And when we come back, we're going to have more Brian Stelter, including what is on the mind when it comes to Fox producers as they hear their hosts spout out conspiracy theories and things they know are outright lies. The answers may surprise you.